I still remember the first night I heard the bell. It wasn't supposed to ring. That's what everyone in town said. The clock tower had been shut for years, locked behind rusted iron doors and boarded windows that no one bothered to question anymore. But on nights like this, when the wind moves through the empty streets like something searching for its own body, I swear I can still hear it breathing above the rooftops. I was walking home alone that evening, passing the old stone bridge near the river, where the water always looks darker than it should. My phone had died hours ago, and the streetlights kept flickering like they were struggling to remember how to stay awake. That's when I noticed a sound. A single bell. Slow. Heavy, like it wasn't marking time, but counting something. I stopped in the middle of the road, listening. No cars. No voices. Just that bell echoing from somewhere high above the fog. My father used to say the clock tower only rang when something inside it wanted attention. I always thought it was just one of his old stories. Until I looked up. The tower wasn't supposed to have light. But on the highest window, something moved past the glass, slow, deliberate, like it had been waiting for me to notice all along. And then the bell rang again, closer this time, as if the sound had stepped down one level toward me. That's when I saw it. I was walking along the edge of the village road just after midnight, where the pavement turns uneven and the streetlights struggle to stay lit. The air carried a faint chill, mixed with the dry scent of roadside dust and something like old paper burning far away. My footsteps sounded too loud in the quiet, each one landing with a small echo that didn't feel natural in such an empty place. To my left, the fields were dark shapes pressed against the horizon, and to my right, scattered houses stood with their windows dimmed as if they were already asleep. The clock tower was visible from almost everywhere in town, even if you tried not to look at it. Tonight it stood farther than usual, rising above the rooftops like a broken spine against the sky. Everyone said its mechanism stopped years ago. My father used to say a stop clock is never truly silent. It just learns a different way to speak. I never understood what he meant until nights like this, when even memory feels unreliable. I stopped when I heard the first bell. It wasn't loud in the way bells are supposed to be. It felt distant at first, like it didn't belong in the air around me, like it had traveled through something heavier than space before reaching my ears. Then it deepened, my shoes pressed into the road, and I felt it there too, a faint vibration running to the ground as if the earth had recognized the sound before I did. For a moment, even my breathing felt out of rhythm with everything else. A few houses along the road reacted without reason. Warm candlelight flickered behind curtains, one by one, like someone inside each home had opened their eyes at the same instant. Then, just as quickly, every light went out together. No delay, no hesitation. Only darkness settling back over the street, as if nothing had happened at all. I remember thinking how strange it was that silence can feel heavier after something breaks it. I started walking again, slower this time. My throat felt dry, and I kept swallowing just to make sure I still could. The road stretched ahead without curves, but it didn't feel familiar anymore. It felt slightly rearranged, like it had been placed there moments ago and hadn't decided where to settle yet. The air carried a faint metallic taste now, though there was no source I could see. Then the bell rang again. The second time it was closer, not louder, closer. It didn't come from the tower anymore. It came from somewhere behind the houses, somewhere low and near the road itself, as if it had stepped down from its height and was now moving through the same space I occupied. My shoulders tightened without permission, and I stopped walking before I realized I had done it. A memory slipped through my thoughts, uninvited. My father standing near our old porch, fixing a broken wind chime without looking at it, saying that some sounds don't travel through air the way they should. They travel through attention. I remember laughing at him then. It doesn't feel like something I would laugh at now. The streetlights above me flickered once, not in sequence but together, like they were sharing the same breath. For a brief moment, I thought I saw a shape near the far bend of the road. Not fully formed, not clear enough to name. It didn't move like it was approaching or leaving. It simply existed for a fraction of time before deciding not to be seen. I forced myself to look toward the clock tower again. The highest window was no longer dark. There was a faint glow inside it, pale and uncertain, like something holding a light without understanding what light was for. I could not tell if it was reflection or presence, and I didn't want to decide. The bell rang a third time, right behind me, close enough that the sound didn't travel through the air first. It arrived already inside the space around my head, already completed, as if it had been waiting there, and only chose to become audible now. My entire body went still before I could think about moving, and then everything stopped. No wind, no distant rustle from the fields, no echo from the road beneath me. Even the faint noise of my own breathing felt uncertain, like it wasn't sure it belonged anymore. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It felt occupied. The alley was narrower than I remembered, though I couldn't say when I had last been here with certainty. It sat behind the main road like a forgotten scene between buildings, lined with shuttered shops and peeling posters that looked like they had been left to age in layers. The night air felt colder here, not in temperature but in presence, like the space itself had stopped agreeing with time. My footsteps echoed in a way that didn't match the surface beneath me, soft but slightly delayed, as if the ground was deciding when to answer. A faint smell drifted through the alley, cold metal mixed with old sugar, like a bakery that had been sealed before it could finish cooling. I turned my head toward the lock shop on my left. The metal gate was covered in rusted chains, yet I could almost hear something faint inside it. Not movement, a rhythm, like counting that had forgotten what numbers meant. That was when I noticed my shadow. It wasn't wrong at first, just late. I lifted my hand slowly, watching it move across the wall. My shadow followed a second after, stretching and catching up too carefully, like it was practicing the motion before committing to it. I stopped walking. My shadow didn't stop immediately. It took that same missing second to decide I had stopped. A chill moved across my spine, slow and deliberate, though I couldn't tell if it came from the air or from realizing I was no longer perfectly aligned with myself. Somewhere deeper in the alley, a ticking sound emerged. It didn't belong to any visible object. There were no clocks here, no watches, nothing that should carry that kind of rhythm. It came instead from inside the closed bakery oven behind the metal gate. Not loud, not even consistent, but present enough that my attention kept returning to it without permission. I stepped closer. The oven door was sealed shut, but I could feel the ticking through the metal, like something inside was trying to remember how to be time again. My hand hovered near the surface, and for a brief moment, I thought I felt warmth. Then it vanished, replaced by something colder than I could place. Not temperature, condition. The alley smelled stronger now. Old sugar, yes, but now layered with something like oxidized air, as if the space had been left exposed too long, and had started to change composition. Above me, the clock tower was not visible, but I could feel it, not as a shape or distance, but as a pressure beneath the street itself, like something large pressing gently upward from below reality. Every few seconds, a faint echo of the bell traveled through the ground, not reaching the sky, but passing through it like a memory trying to surface and failing halfway. I swallowed and continued walking. My footsteps grew quieter as I moved deeper, but the delay in my shadow remained. It always arrived slightly after me, like it was no longer fully convinced we were the same person. I tried not to look directly at it again. The alley bent slightly to the left, and the walls grew closer. Posters on the brick surface peeled in layers, revealing older posters beneath them, each one advertising things I couldn't fully read. Some looked like warnings. Others looked like invitations that had been abandoned mid-sentence. Then the light changed. A single streetlight above flickered once, weak and uncertain, then steady just long enough for me to see the far end of the alley. Someone was standing there, or at least something that occupied the shape of standing. It wasn't there a moment ago. I am certain of that in the only way I can still trust anything. The figure didn't move. It didn't react to the light, or to me noticing it. It simply existed in the exact space where the alley should have been empty. My breath caught without sound. For a brief instant, I thought I could hear the ticking change pace, as if it had become aware of my attention. The sound from the bakery oven faded, replaced by something softer, almost like counting backwards without urgency. The street light flickered again, and the figure was gone, not walking away, not retreating, just no longer there, as if the alley had decided it had never placed anything in that position at all. I stood very still, waiting for my mind to correct itself. It didn't. Instead, I noticed a shadow again. It had caught up completely now. It was standing where I was standing, perfectly aligned for the first time since I entered the alley. But it wasn't following my movement anymore. It was facing slightly ahead of me, like it knew something I didn't. And somewhere beneath the street, the faint pressure of the bell returned, closer than before, as the ground had begun remembering how to open. I reached the bus stop just as the wind shifted direction, pushing a thin layer of dust across the cracked pavement. It was one of those old shelters made of metal and glass, the kind that once tried to look modern, but now only looked forgotten. The glass panels were fractured in spiderweb patterns, and the bench inside had rust spreading across its edges like something slow and patient. Above it, a broken advertisement frame flickered weakly, though I knew there was no electricity running through this part of town at this hour. Still, it was glowing. I stepped closer, hesitating only for a moment before entering the shelter. The air inside felt tighter, like it had been used too many times and hadn't been refreshed. A faint smell lingered, old rain trapped in metal seams, mixed with something sharper, like burnt paper that never finished burning. The advertisement screen crackled again. At first, it showed static. Then an image formed. The clock tower. I froze. It shouldn't have been possible. This screen had no connection, no signal, no reason to display anything at all, let alone something so specific. Yet there it was, clear enough that I could see the broken top of the tower and the dark slit of its highest window. My reflection appeared faintly over it, layered on top of the image, but slightly out of sync. When I moved my head, the reflection hesitated before following. Then the minute hand on the tower clock moved, backward, not smoothly, not like a mechanism working correctly. It jerked, paused, then dragged itself against the direction of time, as if resisting the idea of going forward at all. My throat tightened. A soft sound spread through the shelter, coming from everywhere and nowhere at once. It wasn't wind. It wasn't static. It was something like rust-colored breath passing through empty space. A stain began forming on the bench beside me, slowly at first, then without hesitation. It spread outward without source, without liquid, without touch, just appearance. A deep rust tone bleeding into the metal surface, as if the material had suddenly remembered it was supposed to decay. I stepped back instinctively, my shoes scraping against the floor, but the sound felt delayed, like it belonged to a slightly different moment. The ticking returned, not from the screen this time, from inside the shelter itself. Each tick felt like it was being counted in reverse, not subtracting time, but undoing it in small, fragile pieces. I found myself listening too closely, as if my attention was part of the mechanism now. Then the whisper came. It didn't have direction. It wrapped around the shelter like it had always been there, and was only now becoming audible. 1, 2, 3, 4, counting backwards. I pressed my hand against my ear without thinking, but it didn't help. The numbers weren't sound alone. They felt embedded in the air and the glass, even in the slight vibration under my feet. I looked back at the advertisement screen. The clock tower image had changed. The window at the top was no longer dark. Something moved behind it. Not clearly, not fully, just enough to make my eyes refuse to focus properly. A cold gust pushed through the shelter, though there were no openings large enough for wind to behave that way. The whispering stopped mid-count, leaving an uncomfortable gap in the air, like a sentence cut before meaning could complete itself. Then I heard it, a bus approaching, but there were no headlights, no engine sound, only the sensation of weight arriving in front of me, as if something massive had decided to occupy space without announcing itself properly. I turned toward the road. The bus was already there, doors open, completely silent. The interior lights were on, faint and pale, revealing rows of empty seats stretching into darkness that didn't quite behave like depth. No driver was visible. No movement came from inside. Only stillness, waiting in a shape that resembled transportation. My hand tightened around the edge of the shelter bench, without me meaning to. The rust stain beside me had spread further now, reaching the edge of where I stood moments before. The whisper did not return, but the ticking did, slower this time. like something inside the bus was counting for me instead. My coat felt heavier than it should have when I reached into the pocket. I hadn't decided to check it. I don't even remember putting my hand there. It was just suddenly inside the fabric. Fingers brushing against something thin and folded, like paper that had been waiting for me longer than I had been aware of it. I pulled it out slowly. A map. Old. Hand-drawn. The paper was stiff with age, smelling faintly of dried leaves and something burned at the edges, like it had once been too close to a flame, but refused to disappear completely. I unfolded it under the weak light from a distant street lamp. At first, it looked like a normal layout of the town. Roads, intersections, the river cutting through the edge like a shallow scar. But the longer I stared, the more wrong it became. The clock tower appeared more than once, not as repetition, as displacement. One mark placed near the riverbank, another in the center of a marketplace that doesn't exist anymore, another pressed into the edge of a field I've never walked through, though my mind insists I should recognize it. Each location was marked with a symbol, an eye, a bell, a key, a door. I didn't understand why my fingers were shaking until I noticed the first change. The moment my thumb touched the eye symbol, a bell rang somewhere above me. Not loud, not distant, just present, like it had been triggered by contact instead of time. I pulled my hand back immediately. The sound stopped. I swallowed, carefully pressing my palm near the bell symbol instead, testing it without wanting to believe I was testing anything at all. Another bell, this time sharper, closer. It didn't echo like before. It felt immediate, as if the sound had been released in the same space I occupied rather than traveling into it. My breathing slowed without permission. I looked around the empty street. Nothing moved. No lights flickered. No shadows shifted incorrectly like earlier. But the silence felt strained, like it was holding something in place by effort alone. I hesitated before touching the key symbol. The instant my finger made contact, the air tightened. Not pressure exactly, more like expectation. A third bell rang, and I felt it in my teeth. A brief vibration ran through my jaw, then down into my chest, like something inside my body had been used as part of the sound itself. I stepped back from the map, holding it slightly away from me now. The paper should have been just paper, but it wasn't behaving like something inert anymore. The edges seemed to darken faintly, ink bleeding into places that hadn't been drawn before. Fine lines spreading outward like veins finding new routes. I watched as a section near the top of the map shifted, subtle at first, then clarified into something new, a location that hadn't been there before, a mark forming itself without my touch. My stomach tightened. The symbol that appeared was a door, but wasn't aligned with any road I recognized. It sat slightly off the drawn geography, like it belonged to a layer beneath the map rather than on it. The paper gave a soft sound as I held it, almost like it was breathing through the fibers. For a moment, I thought I saw the ink shift again, forming faint outlines of movement between the marked places. Not travel routes, not paths, something more like repetition, as if the tower was not a single place, but something that could exist in multiple positions without ever being wrong. I folded the map halfway, then stopped, because I realized something uncomfortable. Every mark I had touched, the bell had responded, and I had touched all three symbols without meaning to test anything at all. A faint sound drifted through the air again, but it wasn't a full bell this time, more like the memory of one, stretched thin across distance. I looked down at the map again. The new location had darkened further. The door symbol was no longer static. It looked settled, like it had chosen where it belonged. And for a brief moment, I felt something like ink beneath my fingers again, though I hadn't touched the paper this time. The map remained open in my hands, waiting, as if it was expecting me to confirm the last place it had decided to become. The apartment building stood at the end of the street, like something left unfinished. 5 floors, old brick, windows arranged in rigid rows that once looked orderly, but now felt slightly uneven, as if the structure had shifted its memory of itself over time. The entrance door hung half open, swaying faintly even though there was no wind strong enough to justify it. I stepped inside anyway. The air changed immediately. Dust filled the space in soft layers, but it wasn't falling the way dust should. It moved upward in slow, uncertain trails, like the building had forgotten which direction gravity was supposed to obey. My footsteps sounded delayed again, each step arriving a fraction too late, echoing as if someone was repeating me a second after I moved. The hallway stretched ahead, lined with doors that all looked identical. Above me, the first window blinked. Not metaphorically. The curtain inside it closed, then opened too slowly to feel natural, like an eye trying to remember how blinking worked. I stopped walking. The building didn't. Somewhere above, footsteps continued. Soft, measured, matching mine. Except I wasn't moving anymore. I looked up the stairwell. Empty. Still, the sound persisted, each step landing just after mine should have, as if the building was replaying my presence without asking permission. The smell shifted slightly as I climbed. Old wood, faint mildew, and something sharper underneath, like static trapped in fabric. A second window blinked, then a third, each one in a different floor, never synchronized but never random either, like the building was practicing awareness in sections. I pressed my hand against the wall. It felt colder than expected, but not in temperature alone, more like it had been left untouched for too long, and had started to forget warmth existed at all. The dust around my fingers lifted upward again, brushing past my knuckles instead of falling away. That's when I heard the chime. Not from outside, from inside the stairwell itself. Soft glass tapping glass. Repeating, not rhythmically at first, then more consistent, like something was testing resonance. I continued upward slowly. The footsteps above me stopped when mine stopped, then resumed when I moved again. It wasn't chasing. It was matching. That realization made my chest tighten more than anything I had felt so far. I passed a landing where the paint on the walls peeled in long strips. Underneath, older wallpaper showed through. Faded floral patterns, then older brick, then something that looked almost like writing but refused to stay still long enough to read. One of the doors on the landing was slightly open, just enough for darkness to spill into the hallway. I didn't look directly at it for long. The windows along the stairwell shifted again. Now, they were blinking faster. Too fast. Curtains snapping shut and opening in uneven cycles, like something inside each room was trying to signal without knowing the language. My breathing felt louder than it should have been. The footsteps above paused. For a moment, everything aligned. My stillness, the building's stillness. Even the drifting dust seemed to hesitate midair. Then every window in the building turned. Not the curtains, the windows themselves. All at once, every single pane oriented toward me, as if the entire structure had decided I was the only thing worth looking at. I froze on the stairwell landing. No sound came from above now. No footsteps. No chime. Just a sensation of being observed from every possible angle at once, through glass that didn't reflect properly anymore. My hand stayed on the railing, without moving. I thought about stepping back down, but the stairs behind me felt different now. Not blocked, just no longer certain they led anywhere I had already been. The building held that silence for a long moment. Then one window, somewhere on the top floor, blinked once more, slowly, deliberately, and stayed open. The courtyard was empty in the way places become when they stop expecting visitors. It sat between broken walls of an old municipal building. Tiles cracked and scattered like pale fragments of something that had once been carefully maintained. I stood at the edge of it for a moment before stepping in, because the air felt wrong in a way I couldn't immediately name. Not colder, not warmer, just reversed in its intention, like it had forgotten whether it was supposed to push me away or let me pass. Then I saw the rain. It wasn't falling. It was rising. Thin streams of water lifted from the ground, pulling upward in uneven threads toward the sky, as if gravity had changed its mind mid-thought. Each drop separated from puddles below and drifted up slowly, catching the faint light in a way that made everything shimmer, without clarity. I took one step forward. My shoe pressed into a shallow puddle, and the reflection inside it didn't match me immediately. It lagged, a fraction behind. Then, too late, it formed, my face looking back at me with a smile I wasn't making. I stepped back instinctively, my breath tightening in my chest. The ripples on the water surface moved upward instead of outward, erasing themselves into the air above like memory being pulled away rather than disturbed. The clock tower was visible now. I stopped. It had not been there before. It rose beyond the courtyard walls, taller than I remembered it ever being, its silhouette sharp against a sky that didn't seem fully dark anymore. The highest window was faintly lit, though the light didn't spread outward. It stayed contained, like it refused to acknowledge the space around it. A bell rang. Once, and every rising drop of rain shifted direction for a brief moment, hesitating midair before continuing upward again. I felt it in my chest more than my ears. A pressure, then release, then silence. But not empty silence. Controlled silence. I looked down at the puddle again. My reflection had changed position slightly. Still me, still standing, but my head tilted a fraction to the side, as if it had been listening to something I hadn't heard yet. I tried to steady my breathing, but the sound of it felt too present in the courtyard, like it didn't belong to me alone anymore. A memory surfaced without permission, not a clear one, just a feeling of being small, standing near a window, hearing something I wasn't supposed to understand. My father's voice nearby, calm but distant, saying I shouldn't look too long at things that don't agree with time. I blinked hard. The memory didn't settle. The rain kept rising, and then I noticed my footprints. I turned slowly, looking back along the path I had entered through. They were still there, but they weren't pointing toward where I had come from. They were leading away from me, not forward into the courtyard, not backward toward the exit, away, as if I had already chosen a direction I hadn't consciously taken yet. My throat tightened, and for a moment I didn't move at all. Above me, another cluster of water droplets paused midair. They hung there longer than they should have, trembling slightly, like they were waiting for permission to continue. The clock tower remained still, watching without motion. The reflection in the puddle didn't smile this time. It just waited, and I found myself standing very quietly in the middle of rising rain, realizing the ground behind me no longer felt like it belonged to the same version of me that had arrived. The train station beneath the city had been closed for so long that most people forgot it existed at all. I only found it because of the stairwell that shouldn't have been open. Concrete steps descending into a place where the air changed temperature with every few meters, growing warmer, then colder again, as if the underground couldn't decide what season it wanted to remember. At the bottom, the platform stretched out in silence. No trains ran here anymore, at least none that were recorded anywhere above ground. But the space was still lit. Hundreds of candles placed along platform edges, their flames steady in a way that didn't match airflow or logic. The light they cast wasn't warm. It was pale, almost tired. Wax dripped upward, slow streams lifting toward the ceiling instead of falling, tracing thin lines like frozen rain climbing back into the sky. I stood still for a moment, watching one candle bend its melted shape upward, as if it had forgotten what direction melting was supposed to obey. The smell hit me next. Old wax, burnt wick, and something underneath it, faint but unsettling, like paper left too long in closed books. I stepped onto the platform. My footsteps didn't echo correctly. They arrived slightly late, like the station was replaying me after I had already moved. The bell sound was here too, but it wasn't clear. It felt submerged, like I was hearing it through thick water. Each tone arrived muffled, delayed, as if the sound itself had to pass through layers of something dense before reaching me. I looked at the stone benches along the wall. Names were carved into them. At first, I thought they were random. Then I saw mine, not just similar, exact. My full name etched into the stone like it had always belonged there. I ran my fingers lightly across it, without thinking. The stone felt warm where it shouldn't have, as if it had been recently touched by something living. Another bench nearby had more names. Some I recognized in a way I couldn't explain. Others felt like they should matter to me, even though I couldn't place why. Above me, the station clock hung from a broken metal beam. It showed multiple times at once, hands overlapping, positions contradicting each other, without settling into one truth. The glass face reflected candlelight in uneven fragments, making it impossible to tell which time was being shown and which were being remembered. A low vibration passed through the platform. Not loud, not even fully audible, but I felt in my ribs. The bell, again, stronger this time, but still distorted, as if it had been compressed through layers of distance and memory before arriving here. The candles flickered all at once, then steadied, then flickered again in a different pattern, like they were reacting to something approaching rather than air movement. I turned toward the far end of the platform. The tunnel was dark, but not empty. Something was there beyond the edge of light, where the candle glow stopped being useful. A shape of absence more than presence. Not defined enough to describe, but certain enough to feel. The air grew heavier. Wax continued climbing upward, now faster, like the entire station was slowly reversing its relationship with gravity. Then I heard it. A train. No sound of wheels. No tracks vibrating. Only the sensation of arrival, like the space itself had decided something large was entering it without permission. The candles leaned slightly, all at once, as if reacting to pressure from a direction I couldn't see. The darkness at the tunnel's mouth deepened, and then the train arrived, not emerging, not entering, just suddenly present at the platform edge. Doors already aligned with where I stood. No headlights, no engine, no sound except a faint settling of air, like something had just finished becoming real. The doors opened, slowly, completely silent. Inside, there were no seats I could clearly define. Only dim rows fading into depth that didn't behave like distance. The light inside was the same tired pale glow as the candles, but flatter, like it had no source. I didn't move. I couldn't tell if waiting was my decision anymore. The station behind me felt quieter than before, as if it was holding its breath, and the train stood open, patient in a way that didn't feel like transportation at all. More like invitation, without words. The field stretched wide under a pale winter sky, flat and silent, except for the way frost spread across the ground in perfect circular patterns. I had no memory of how I reached it. One moment there had been stairs, candlelight, the weight of underground air. The next, I was standing in open cold, surrounded by grass turned stiff and white. Each blade outlined like it had been carefully drawn rather than grown. The wind moved, but it didn't feel like it belonged to the weather. It felt measured. Every few seconds, the bell rang. Not from above, not from distance. It felt like it came from inside the field itself. And each time it rang, everything paused. The frost stopped expanding. The wind froze mid-motion. Even the faint drifting particles in the air held still for exactly 1 second, as if the world had learned a rule it was forced to obey. Then everything continued again, always without hesitation. I took a step forward during one of the moving moments, but I noticed something immediately after. The pause had taken something from me. Not physically, a fraction of memory. Like a word you almost remember but lose at the edge of thought. My breath came out visibly in the cold air, but it wasn't just vapor. For a moment, it formed shapes, numbers, then they broke apart. I stared at my hands, flexing my fingers slowly. The cold should have hurt more than it did, but the sensation felt muted, as if my body was slightly behind the experience of being in it. The bell rang again. Everything froze, including me, but not completely. I could still think, still see, and in that frozen second, I saw myself. A second version of me standing across the field, perfectly still, facing in my direction but not reacting, as if it had been placed there earlier and was waiting for the exact moment I would notice it. The second passed. Everything resumed. I stumbled slightly without meaning to, my balance delayed as if my body had forgotten where it was in space for a fraction of time. The wind returned, carrying faint voices beneath it. Not words at first, just tone, warnings repeated in fragments that almost formed meaning before dissolving again. I turned slowly, scanning the field. The frost patterns were changing subtly now, not growing randomly anymore, forming arcs that seemed to point toward the same direction I was standing in. Another bell, pause, silence, and in that frozen second, I realized the second version of me was no longer across the field. It was closer, not moving, just reappearing between pauses, as if each missing second was relocating it without showing transition. My chest tightened, the wind resumed. And I could feel something missing again. Another small piece of time that I couldn't name, only feel gone. The voices in the air grew clearer for a moment. Still not fully words, but closer. Like something trying to remember how language fit inside breath. I looked down at the frost beneath my feet. The circular patterns were no longer random. They were layered, repeating in tighter rings, all centered around where I stood, as if I was no longer in the field. But the field was organizing itself around me. Another bell. Everything stopped again. And this time, in the frozen silence, I understood something I didn't want to understand. The second version of me wasn't copying me. It was completing me. The second passed. The world resumed. But something essential didn't return with it, and the field felt closer now, like it had shifted inward by a step I never saw happen. The bell tower interior was narrower than I expected, rising in a tight vertical column that made every sound feel compressed between stone and air. I climbed without knowing how I got inside. There had been no clear door, no entry point I could remember stepping through, just a sudden sense of being within the structure, as if the tower had accepted me the same way a thought accepts a mind. The walls were lined with mirrors, not one or two, dozens, cracked, uneven, some tilted at angles that made the space feel larger than it should have been. Each mirror reflected a slightly different version of the same tower interior, like the building was testing alternate memories of itself. My footsteps sounded soft against the stone steps, but the echoes came late, always late, like the tower was replaying my presence after I had already moved past it. A faint scent lingered in the air, old glass mixed with damp stone, and something faintly metallic underneath, like air that had passed through too many closed mechanisms. I stopped at the first landing, looked into the nearest mirror. At first, I saw myself, standing still, but the reflection didn't fully match my position. Its head turned slightly before mine did, not dramatically, just enough to be wrong. I stepped closer, and the reflection hesitated before mirroring me again, as if it needed permission to continue. In the next mirror over, I wasn't there at all. Only the tower interior stood empty, the staircase rising without me in it. I felt my throat tighten. Another mirror showed me standing in a different position entirely, higher up the staircase, already closer to the bell chamber. My clothes were slightly different in that reflection, though I couldn't immediately say how. The bell rang once above me. Not loud, not distant, contained. The sound didn't travel through air the way it should have. It felt like it originated inside the mirrors themselves, as if each surface had its own version of bell, and they all agreed to ring at once. The glass vibrated faintly, not enough to shake, just enough to remind me it could. I moved upward slowly. Each step felt heavier than the last, though my body didn't change. It was as if the tower was assigning weight to time instead of matter. The mirrors began to shift more noticeably now. Some showed me walking backward while I moved forward. Others showed me standing still long after I had already left that position. One mirror showed me looking directly at it, but I wasn't looking, at least not in real time. The air carried that same old glass scent stronger now, mixed with something like damp memory. I can't explain it better than that. Like remembering something that never fully happened. I reached another landing. The mirrors here were larger, cracked through their centers in irregular lines that didn't distort the reflection so much as divide it. In one mirror, I saw the tower exterior instead of the interior, as if that piece of glass belonged to a different place entirely. And in that reflection, the sky looked slightly wrong. Heavier, closer. I stepped away from it quickly, too quickly. My reflection in a nearby mirror reacted late again, stumbling a fraction after I did. That delay was becoming familiar now. Too familiar. The bell rang again. This time, the mirrors didn't just vibrate. They answered. A ripple of delayed echoes moved through them, like each reflection had received the sound at slightly different times and was still catching up. I pressed my hand against the wall without thinking. Stone, cold, stable, but the mirrors beside it shimmered faintly under my touch, like they were aware of proximity. I continued upward. The staircase narrowed further near the top, forcing me to move slower. The mirrors here were older, their cracks filled with dust that refused to settle properly. It hovered inside the fractures instead. like the glass was holding on to broken moments and refusing to release them. Then I saw it, in one mirror ahead, a reflection of me standing still at the top of the tower, already there, not moving, just waiting. My breath slowed without intention. I turned my head slightly, but in real space there was nothing yet at the top landing, only steps continuing upward into dimness. But the mirror showed me already arrived, and standing beside that reflection, something else, not fully clear, not fully formed, just a presence shaped like absence, positioned close enough that I could feel its certainty even through glass. The bell did not ring this time. It held, like it was waiting for something complete. I took one more step upward. The mirrors along the walls flickered faintly in response, each one adjusting its timing slightly. The reflection at the top in the mirror finally moved. Not away, not toward me, just a small shift of attention, like it had noticed I was still becoming present. I reached the final step. The air here felt thinner, like it had been used too many times. And in the mirror directly ahead of me, my reflection lifted its hand, slowly, without hesitation, then paused, just before contact with the glass, as if waiting for me to decide whether I would follow. A rusted brass key lay half embedded in the wooden bench, like it had grown there over time instead of being placed. I noticed it while walking through a small park I don't remember entering properly. The path curved too neatly, the grass too evenly cut for a place that felt as forgotten. The night air carried a faint dryness, like dried flowers crushed between pages, and every step I took made the gravel respond a fraction late. The key didn't look new. It looked remembered. I knelt slowly and touched it. Cold metal, but not the kind of cold that belongs to temperature. More like something that had been left untouched by warmth for too long to ever accept it again. The moment my fingers wrapped around it, I heard the bell, not from the clock tower, not from any direction at all. Just a sound that appeared fully formed, like it had been waiting for my attention to exist. I pulled the key free from the bench. The wood resisted slightly, then released it with a soft creak that felt too much like breathing. For a brief moment, the sky above me shifted color, not dramatically, just enough to feel wrong in hindsight, like a faded photograph adjusting itself for a second before settling back into its incorrect version of reality. I stood still, holding the key in my palm. It was heavier than it should have been, not physically, emotionally, if that makes sense, like it carried something beyond weight, something that pressed gently into awareness without asking permission. I turned it between my fingers, slowly, carefully. The instant I did, the bell answered again, fainter this time, but closer in feeling, as if distance no longer mattered as much as intention. Then I heard my voice, except I hadn't spoken. It came from just ahead of me, layered slightly out of sync with my thoughts, repeating the same breath I was about to take a second before I actually took it. I froze. The voice continued, not saying words yet, just anticipating them. Like something was learning how I form sentences before I decided to form them myself. A faint laugh drifted through the park, childlike, but not placed. I turned my head slowly, scanning the empty space between trees and benches. Nothing moved, but the sound lingered in patches, like it had bounced off invisible surfaces that weren't there anymore. The key in my hand grew slightly warmer, not comfortingly, just noticeably, as if it had acknowledged being used. I tightened my grip without meaning to. The bell returned again, softer, stretched thin across distance that didn't behave like space anymore. It felt like it was passing through layers of memory rather than air. I looked down at the bench. The place where the key had been embedded was still there, but it would look different now. Older, more worn, like the moment of removal had rewritten how long it had been there in the first place. I lifted the key again, and for a second, I thought I saw another version of my hand holding it already, slightly offset from mine, repeating the same motion half a breath early. I let go of the thought quickly. The sky shifted again, just slightly, like a page turning without sound. I turned the key once more, this time slower, more deliberate. The bell did not ring immediately. It waited. That waiting felt worse than the sound itself. Then it rang, and the park around me felt briefly lighter, as if something had been unlocked that wasn't physically present in front of me. I looked at the key again. The metal surface now reflected something faint that wasn't just me. Not a clear image, just the suggestion of alignment, as if it knew exactly where it belonged. And without fully deciding to, I noticed my feet were no longer pointed toward the path I had entered from. The town did not feel like it was repeating at first. It only felt slightly misplaced. I walked down the main street thinking I had simply taken a wrong turn, but every storefront looked familiar in a way that made my thoughts uneasy. The same faded signs, the same cracked window displays, even the same small dent in the metal shutter outside the pharmacy. But when I passed it again, the dent was on the opposite side. That was the first time I stopped. The night air was heavier here, not with moisture, but with expectation, like the town was waiting to see if I would notice too much. My footsteps echoed softly on the pavement, but each echo arrived a fraction late, as if the street was replaying my movement instead of responding to it. I turned left at the next intersection, and ended up at the clock tower. Again, only this time it was closer, too close. I stood still, staring up at it, trying to convince myself I had simply circled back. But the angle was wrong. The distance had changed. The tower felt like it had moved toward me, without physically moving at all. A bell rang, soft, controlled, like breathing. I turned away immediately and walked down a different street. The same storefront appeared again. Same broken glass display. Same flickering sign. But now the colors were slightly washed differently, like a memory of the same place instead of the place itself. My throat felt dry. I kept walking, faster this time. Every intersection led me somewhere I had already been. The town was no longer arranged in a linear way. It felt layered, like multiple versions of itself were stacked on top of each other, and I was moving through them without choosing which layer I belonged to. The bell rang again, steadier now, like it was tracking something. I stopped walking for a moment, trying to listen properly, but the silence between the rings wasn't empty anymore. It carried faint echoes of my own movements, slightly out of sync, as if I had already walked these streets before and was only now catching up to the memory of it. A street sign above me shifted, not physically bending, just changing, the letters rearranging themselves when I blinked. I turned sharply down another road. The clock tower appeared again, but this time it was slightly farther, then closer again. I couldn't tell which was true. The air felt wrong in my chest, like I was breathing through overlapping versions of the same moment. My mind started to resist remembering where I had already been, as if remembering too much would cause the structure of the town to collapse inward. A faint static-like whisper moved through the street. Not words, not sound in the usual sense, more like fragments of direction without language. I kept walking. At some point, I noticed something ahead, a figure, standing still at an intersection. I slowed without thinking, then realized something that made my stomach tighten. I had seen it before, not just earlier in this walk, earlier in this loop, because the moment I turned my head slightly, I saw another version of myself further down the street, standing where I had been moments ago, looking in my direction, not moving, just observing. And before I could fully process it, I realized something worse. There was another me behind me, and another ahead, each one positioned slightly differently in the street layout, as if the town had been replaying me at different points and I had started to overlap with my own repetitions. The bell rang again, stronger, and for a brief moment, all versions of me looked up at the same time. The street froze in its arrangement, like it was deciding which version was real enough to continue. Then the moment passed, and I was still walking, but I couldn't tell which I had taken the step. The suitcase was sitting in the middle of the road, not on the side, not near a curb, right in the center, like it had been placed there with intention and then forgotten by the world around it. The street itself was empty, stretching in both directions without cars or movement. The night air carried a faint dampness, like rain that had already happened but refused to fully leave. My footsteps slowed before I even realized I was approaching it. It was old, dark fabric, scuffed edges, a metal latch dull with age. But what bothered me most wasn't its condition. It was how still it felt in a place that refused to stay consistent. I stopped a few feet away. The suitcase made no sound, yet I could hear something inside it. A ticking, not steady like a clock. More uneven, like time itself had been folded and trapped in small fragments, each piece trying to continue independently from the others. I knelt slowly. The smell reached me before I touched it. Rain trapped in wood. That strange, stale scent of something that never fully dries, mixed with faint undertone of old cloth left too long in closed spaces. My fingers hovered above the latch. The ticking shifted slightly, as if it had noticed me noticing it. I touched the suitcase. A weight immediately settled into my hands that didn't match its size. It wasn't heavier in the physical sense, but it felt layered, like holding more than one moment at once. The bell sounded faintly in the distance. Not loud, almost gentle, but present enough to make the street feel slightly narrower than before. I opened the latch. It clicked softly, too softly. Inside, there was nothing visible. No clothes, no objects, no contents at all. Only wrapped bundles of cloth, each one tightly folded and tied, each emitting a faint ticking sound from within, as if they were containing something that refused to become visible. I leaned closer without meaning to. The ticking grew clearer and heavier, each one slightly out of sync with the others, forming a pattern that didn't repeat correctly. My chest felt subtly heavier the longer I listened, as if the sound was adding weight to my breathing. I tried to step back, but my body hesitated. Not fear exactly, more like resistance from the air itself. The suitcase creaked slightly wider. I hadn't moved it. The bell returned again, softer than before, almost like it was speaking from somewhere close rather than far away. And with it came a feeling I couldn't ignore. Something was listening back through the ticking, not reacting, not responding, just aware. I shut the suitcase quickly. The latch snapped louder than expected, echoing down the empty road. Silence followed immediately. Too clean, too absolute. I stood up slowly, my hands still slightly tense, watching the suitcase as if it might decide to change again. The air around it smelled stronger now, like rain pressed into it for too long. The ticking didn't stop. It just became quieter, more intimate, like it had moved closer, without physically changing distance. I stepped back one pace, then another. The suitcase remained exactly where it was, but something about its shape felt more open than before. Not physically, conceptually, as if closing it had not reversed anything, only delayed it. A faint vibration passed through the road beneath my feet. Not the bell this time. Something smaller, like anticipation. The suitcase shifted slightly, just enough to suggest it wasn't resting the way it had been a moment ago. I looked at it for a long time without blinking. Then I noticed something that made my throat tighten. The road behind me no longer felt like it led away from the suitcase. It felt like it led toward it. The alley was so narrow I had to turn slightly sideways to walk through it. Brick walls on both sides pressing close. Their surfaces damp in places that smelled faintly of old rain and dust trapped for too long. The air felt heavier here, not in pressure, but in awareness, like the space itself was paying attention to how I moved through it. I stopped when I noticed the wall. It wasn't different at first, just brick, worn and uneven, but then it shifted, a slow expansion, subtle enough that my mind tried to dismiss it before it committed to noticing. The wall seemed to inhale, then release, not collapsing, not breaking, just breathing. I stepped closer without meaning to. The mortar lines between the bricks darkened slightly, then lightened again, like veins pulsing under skin that didn't belong to anything living. My hand hovered near the surface. The bell rang somewhere distant, soft, measured. The wall reacted, not visibly at first, but I felt it, a faint pressure change in the air, like the alley had tightened around that sound. I placed my fingertips against the brick. It was warm, not temperature warm, alive warm. The surface expanded gently under my touch, then contracted again, as if acknowledging contact and then reconsidering it. A low vibration moved through the wall. It matched something in my chest before I realized what it was. My heartbeat. For a moment, they aligned, then drifted apart again. I pulled my hand back quickly. The wall did not return to stillness. It kept breathing, slow, uncertain, like it had been interrupted mid-thought. A faint scratching sound appeared above me. I looked up. The upper part of the wall shifted slightly outward, then inward again, as if the building itself was testing whether it could open without breaking. Graffiti on the surface flickered into view, then vanished, then returned in a different place. I tried to focus on one section, but the letters refused to remain stable long enough to read. Every time I looked directly at them, they changed position, like they were avoiding recognition. The bell rang again, closer this time, not louder, closer. The wall responded immediately. Its breathing deepened. The mortar lines widened slightly, then tightened, as if reacting to sound like a pulse trigger. I stepped back instinctively, my shoes scraping the ground too loudly in the enclosed space. The alley felt smaller now, not physically, but conceptually, like the distance between walls had become less reliable. The graffiti flickered again. This time I caught a fragment. Not words, more like intention. Something trying to be read, but refusing completion. The wall expanded outward sharply for a fraction of a second. Not enough to break. Enough to reveal something behind it. Darkness. Not empty darkness. Layered, like there was space beyond the brick that didn't follow the same rules as the alley. I froze. A sound came from inside the wall. Not echo. Not wind. Something pressing forward. Slow. Deliberate. As if testing the boundary between inside and outside. My breath caught without permission. The bell did not ring this time, but I felt its absence as clearly as its presence before. Like the silence itself had been instructed, the wall expanded again. A small section near, I level bulged outward slightly, then paused. I couldn't move, not because I was trapped, because something in me was waiting for the outcome before deciding how to react. The bulge pressed further, then stopped. The alley went completely still. Even the breathing of the wall paused mid-cycle, as if it had been instructed to hold. Then, from inside the brick, something pressed outward again, not breaking through, just touching the boundary. A shape, not fully formed, but enough to suggest intention. My body finally reacted. I stepped back sharply. The sound of my movement echoed too late, arriving after I had already stopped again. The wall settled slightly, but not fully. It remained aware. Breathing resumed, slower now, measured, as if it had decided to wait. And just before I turned to leave, I saw it clearly. A hand, pressing from inside the bricks, not breaking them, just holding them apart for a moment that didn't belong to either side. The house was already open when I arrived. Not unlocked, not damaged, just open, as if it had never fully agreed to stay closed in the first place. The wooden stairs leading down to the basement creaked under my weight, each step slower than the last, like the house was reconsidering whether I was allowed to descend. The air changed as I went lower. It grew stale, dry in a way that didn't match basements I had known before. It smelled faintly of extinguished candles and damp paper left too long in closed boxes. At the bottom, the room stretched wider than it should have. Clocks lined every wall. None of them had hands. Only empty faces, round and waiting, like they had been stripped of their purpose but not their memory of it. I stepped inside slowly. The moment my foot crossed the threshold, something in my thoughts shifted. Not loudly, just a small loss of orientation, like forgetting a word mid-sentence and not realizing it mattered. I blinked. The room felt slightly different after that blink. Or maybe I did. A faint bell sound reached me from somewhere above, but it was weak here, almost discouraged, as if the space did not fully allow it to enter. I walked closer to the clocks. They didn't move, but they felt aware. Each face seemed to hold a different version of stillness, like time had been paused in multiple ways depending on what had once been inside them. My footsteps made no proper echo. Instead, they returned slightly out of order, arriving after I had already moved on to the next step. I paused. The silence paused with me. That was the first time I noticed it. The basement wasn't just empty of sound. It was selective with memory. I tried to remember why I came down here. The thought formed, then slipped, not gone, just displaced, like it had been placed one step further back than I could reach. I looked down at my hands. They felt normal, but the feeling of normal was starting to lose meaning. A faint bell rang again, this time closer, inside the basement, not above it. One of the clocks on the far wall shivered slightly, not physically shaking, more like it reacted to the sound internally. I took a step backward without thinking. The room didn't follow me. It stayed exactly where it was. But something in it adjusted to my movement, like it had recalculated where I belonged. The air grew heavier in small increments, not pressure. Attention. I tried to speak. Nothing came out at first. Then a fragment of thoughts surfaced instead of words. Why am I here? It dissolved before finishing. Another bell. The clocks responded again, not by moving, by changing how they felt. The emptiness inside became more pronounced, as if they were actively remembering what they no longer contained. I turned slowly. The staircase behind me looked the same, but it didn't feel like the same direction anymore. It felt optional, like it might not lead back to where I started. Even if I climbed it correctly, my chest tightened slightly. I took one step toward it, then stopped, because I realized something unsettling. The clocks on the wall were no longer all facing randomly. They were all subtly angled toward me, not watching, not tracking, just aligned, as if I had become the only moving thing worth measuring. A soft creak echoed somewhere in the room. I didn't see what caused it, and for a moment, I wasn't sure I had moved at all. The bell did not ring again. Instead, the silence that followed felt heavier than the sound had ever been, and the thought I had lost earlier did not return. It simply stopped existing in the place I was standing. The pine forest should have felt familiar. I've walked the woods before, places where ground is soft with needles, and the air carries that clean, sharp scent of sap and cold bark. But this forest didn't feel like any of those memories. It felt like it had been arranged around a question I couldn't fully hear. The trees leaned slightly inward as I moved between them. Not dramatically, just enough to notice when I stopped. Just enough to make me wonder if they were adjusting to my presence rather than growing naturally. The ground beneath my shoes was uneven, packed with old pine needles that gave no proper crunch. The sound came a moment late, as if the forest replayed it after deciding whether it mattered. Somewhere deep in the trees, a bell rang, soft, distant, but not separated by distance in any normal sense. It felt like it passed through the trunks instead of the air. Branches above me creaked in response, not randomly, in rhythm, like they were learning the timing of the sound. I kept walking. I didn't choose direction as much as follow the only path that didn't feel like it was closing behind me. The smell of sap grew stronger, then changed slightly. Something metallic began to mix with it. Faint at first, like rust hiding under fresh wood. I frowned without meaning to, trying to understand where it came from. That was when I heard footsteps behind me. I stopped. They stopped. I took a step forward. They matched it exactly. Not delayed. Not early. Perfect. My throat tightened slightly. I turned my head just a little. Nothing there. Only trees, close and watching in their own way. I tried walking again, slower this time. The footsteps followed, identical, as if the forest had decided to reuse my movement instead of generating its own response. A faint wind passed through the branches above, but it didn't feel random. It felt guided, like it was moving between points that already understood where it needed to go. The bell rang again. The trees responded. Their creaking synchronized for a brief moment, like a shared memory being accessed all at once. I pressed my hand against a nearby trunk. It felt warm, not living warm, remembering warm. My fingers left a faint impression in the bark that lingered longer than it should have. When I pulled my hand away, the imprint didn't fade immediately. It stayed there, like the tree was holding on to the shape. I stepped back slowly. The footsteps behind me paused again, then resumed when I moved. I realized something uncomfortable. They weren't following me. They were copying me, as if I was the original movement and everything else was delayed reflection. The sky above the canopy looked wrong in small ways. Too still, too layered, like multiple skies stacked slightly out of alignment, shifting when I wasn't looking directly at them. The smell of sap shifted again, now fully metallic, like air passing through something old and mechanical. The bell sounded once more, closer, inside the forest now, not beyond it. The trees leaned in slightly further. Not enough to trap me, enough to make the space feel less optional. I slowed my breathing without meaning to, and for a brief moment, I thought I heard my own thoughts repeated back to me, not spoken aloud, just echoed correctly, like something had been listening long enough to learn the shape of my mind. The footsteps behind me stopped entirely. I stood still. The forest did not. It continued breathing, shifting, listening, and then a whisper came from somewhere just behind my ear. Soft, precise. It finished a thought I hadn't spoken, word for word, correctly. The hillside was covered in lanterns, but none of them rose. They hung in the air at uneven heights, drifting downward instead of upward, like the sky had lost interest in holding them. Each lantern swayed slightly as it descended, glowing with a faint, tired light that didn't spread far enough to truly illuminate anything around it. I stood at the edge of the slope for a moment before stepping onto it. The ground felt soft underfoot, uneven in a way that suggested movement had been happening here long before I arrived. Not erosion, not wind, something more repetitive, like the land itself had been adjusted too many times and never settled into a final shape. A faint ticking sound drifted through the hillside, inside the lanterns. Not all of them at once. Individual ones scattered, each ticking slightly different, like they were counting separate versions of the same moment. The bell was still there too, but weaker now, almost constant, not ringing in full cycles anymore, just a faint continuation, like it had stopped starting, and was only existing in its aftermath. I moved between the lanterns carefully. One brushed past my shoulder as it descended, and I felt its warmth linger on my sleeve longer than expected. Inside the glass frame, I thought I saw something shift just briefly, but I didn't look long enough to be certain. The air felt watched from below, not above, below, like the hillside itself was observing from beneath its own surface, paying attention without needing to be seen. My steps left shallow impressions in the soil, but those impressions didn't remain consistent. Some faded quickly, others deepened slightly after I had already moved on, as if the ground was reconsidering where I had been. A lantern passed close enough for me to see inside clearly. There was no flame, only darkness moving upward within it, slow and deliberate, like something trying to reverse its own containment. I stopped walking. The lantern did not stop. It continued downward, but its light flickered as it passed me, casting a brief shape across the ground that didn't match its form. I turned my head slightly. More lanterns were descending now, not random, aligned, as if the hillside had started organizing their movement around a pattern I couldn't yet see. The bell grew quieter, but more present in sensation. Less sound, more awareness. I noticed something strange about my shadow. It didn't align with the slope anymore. It lagged behind the angle of my body, like it was still adjusting to gravity's direction. A faint rustle moved through the grass behind me. I turned quickly. Nothing there. Only lanterns continuing their slow descent, each one drifting past the others without collision, as if they had agreed on rules I wasn't part of. The air thickened slightly. Not pressure. Expectation. One lantern descended directly in front of me and paused. Just for a moment, its light dimmed, then brightened again, revealing something inside that wasn't a flame or shadow. Just movement. Upward movement. Contained but persistent. My breath caught without permission. The lantern continued downward after its brief pause, passing me and disappearing further down the slope. The ticking inside it didn't fade. It just blended with the others. A strange harmony of uneven time. I took one step backward, then stopped, because I realized the shadows around the lanterns were no longer stable. They were detaching slightly from their sources, shifting in directions that didn't match the objects casting them. The bell did not change, but everything around it felt more aware of its absence. Another lantern opened slightly as it passed. Not fully, just enough for a sliver of darkness inside to rise toward the glass, pressing gently against the boundary before settling again. I stood still for a long moment, surrounded by descending light that felt less like illumination and more like something being lowered into place. And then I understood, without hearing it directly, that nothing here was moving down anymore. It was being placed. The highway stretched farther than it should have at this hour, its lanes empty and pale under scattered streetlights that flickered like they were unsure they still belonged to the road. I was walking along the shoulder, though I don't remember choosing to walk. At some point, the idea of stopping felt less natural than continuing, as if motion had become the only stable decision left. The signs above the road repeated themselves. Same destinations, same fonts, same faded paint. But every time I looked back at one after passing it, the letters had changed slightly, not fully rewritten, just eroded differently, as if time was forgetting them in inconsistent ways. The air smelled faintly of old engine oil and dry asphalt, though no vehicles had passed in a long time. The silence between distant hums felt stretched, like sound was being held back on purpose. My memory of direction kept slipping. I would decide to go forward, then forget why forward mattered, then decide again. The bell was still present, but now it felt synced with something else. A low mechanical rhythm, not a machine I could see, more like the idea of an engine that no longer needed physical form. Each time it sounded, the horizon seemed slightly closer, not moving toward me, just adjusting its distance without explanation. I stopped at one signpost, looked at it carefully. It showed a name I didn't recognize, even though something inside me insisted I should. I blinked. When I looked again, the name had changed, not into something new, into something almost familiar, but not stable enough to hold on to. I continued walking. At some point, I noticed radio static in the air, not from a device, from the space itself. It carried fragments of speech, but they broke apart before forming complete sentences. A tone of voice would begin, then collapse into noise, then return to something slightly different. I pressed my hand against my ear without thinking. It didn't help. The highway felt longer now. Or maybe it was repeating. I couldn't tell anymore. The lane markings beneath my feet began to blur slightly when I looked at them directly, then sharpen again when I looked away, like the road was refusing to commit to a single version of itself. The bell sounded again, stronger this time. The engine-like rhythm responded immediately, tightening in sync. My steps slowed without permission, and for a moment, I thought I heard something moving behind me. Not footsteps, more like presence adjusting its distance to match mine. I turned my head slightly. Nothing, only the road stretching backward, repeating itself in subtle variations. Then I saw it, a second version of the highway ahead, offset slightly, as if the road had layered itself, and I was now walking between overlapping versions of the same path. I hesitated. My real name, almost formed in my thoughts, but it didn't complete. It dissolved halfway through. That absence felt heavier than forgetting normally should. The radio static grew clearer for a brief second. A voice almost emerged, close enough to understand intention, but not language. Then it broke again. The horizon shifted once more, closer, or I was farther. I couldn't decide which made less sense. My breathing felt unfamiliar for a moment, like I was listening to someone else use it. The bell did not stop. It just became part of the road's rhythm, and I realized I could no longer clearly remember where I had intended to arrive, only that I had once had a destination that felt important enough to name. The workshop smelled like oil that had been left open too long, mixed with dried ink and the faint bitterness of metal filings. I didn't remember entering the house that contained it. One moment there had been the highway, the layered roads, the loss of direction, and then I was standing in a narrow hallway that led here, as if the building had decided I was done wandering. The room opened in front of me like a forgotten thought. Clocks were everywhere, not mounted like decoration, arranged carefully on tables, shelves, hanging from strings, placed inside open drawers, as if someone had once treated them like living things that needed to be stored gently. But every clock had been taken apart, gears exposed, springs loosened, hands removed, each one laid out like an anatomy study that had stopped mid-explanation. It didn't feel abandoned. It felt paused during work that was still ongoing somewhere else. I stepped inside slowly. My footsteps sounded softer here, as if the floor absorbed intention before it became noise. The bell was distant again, but not weak, controlled, like it had been placed behind a curtain. A drawer near the far wall shifted slightly. I stopped. It didn't open fully, just moved enough to suggest it had been touched from inside. The smell of oil grew stronger. Old tools lay scattered across a workbench. Wrenches, fine screwdrivers, and thin metal hooks shaped for mechanisms too delicate to name. Some of them were still slightly warm when I passed near them, though nothing in the room showed signs of recent use. The blueprints on the wall drew my attention. They were pinned in layers, overlapping. At first they looked like designs for clocks. Then I realized they were the same structure repeated. A tower, the clock tower, but not drawn as architecture, drawn as mechanism. No foundation, no visible base, only interlocking systems that suggested it functioned without needing to exist in a fixed place. My throat tightened slightly. I stepped closer. One of the drawings had been marked repeatedly. Circles layered over specific sections, like someone had been trying to understand how something moved rather than how it was built. A faint creak came from behind me. I turned. A chair in the corner of the workshop shifted slightly, just enough to suggest it had been rocked by someone who wasn't there anymore. The bell returned again, stronger this time. The tools on the bench trembled faintly in response, not falling, not shifting fully, just acknowledging the sound like a signal. I walked closer to the chair. It moved again, a small backward rock, then forward, like it was continuing a motion that had started long before I arrived. The air felt heavier near it, filled with a scent of metal worn by use that had no visible source. I looked at the chair carefully. It was facing the workbench, as if someone had been sitting there recently, or had never stopped. A faint scratch sound came from one of the drawers, not opening, just adjusting, like something inside was repositioning itself. I didn't open it. I couldn't tell why, but the decision formed before thought completed it. The bell sounded again, and for a brief moment, all the clocks, every dismantled face in the room, vibrated in unison, not starting, not moving, just reacting, as if they all remembered something at the same time and refused to say it out loud. The chair stopped moving. Completely, the silence that followed felt arranged. I stepped back slowly. My hand brushed against the edge of the workbench, and I felt a faint warmth there too, like the surface still remembered pressure from someone who had been sitting just moments ago, even if no one had been. I turned toward the exit, but the hallway behind me felt slightly different now, shorter or rearranged, as if the workshop was no longer sure how far it needed to extend to let me leave. The fog arrived without warning, but it didn't feel like weather. It felt like translation. One moment the street was there, broken pavement, empty storefronts, the faint outline of distant buildings. The next, everything softened into a dense gray that swallowed distance entirely, as if the world had been rewritten in a language I couldn't fully read. I kept walking anyway, because stopping felt worse than moving into something unknown. The bell was faint here, but it didn't disappear. It changed shape. Each chime felt stretched, like it was being pulled through layers of fog before reaching me. The sound arrived in fragments, never complete at first, then assembling itself in my awareness a second too late. Shapes formed inside the mist, then dissolved, then reformed again slightly differently, like the fog was experimenting with how much reality it could hold at once. I passed what might have been a building, or maybe it was just the memory of one. The edges were too soft to confirm anything. That's when I heard my name. Not clearly, but close enough that my body reacted before my thoughts did. I stopped walking. The fog didn't stop. It moved around me instead, as if I was simply another obstacle it had already accounted for. Then the voice came again, not calling, recognizing. It used a version of my name I hadn't heard since childhood. When I didn't think I remembered until I heard it inside my own chest at the same time it reached my ears. My throat tightened. I turned slowly. Nothing visible, only shifting density inside the fog, like something had just stepped out of alignment with sight rather than space. The bell sounded again. The fog reacted immediately. It didn't move away. It reshaped. Lines formed within it. Brief structures, arch-like outlines that appeared and collapsed in cycles too fast to fully perceive. Each bell chime adjusted their direction, as if the sound was instructing the fog on how to behave. I walked forward again, slower now. The ground beneath me felt uneven, but not physically. More like I was stepping across overlapping versions of terrain that didn't fully agree with each other. The voice returned. Closer. This time it didn't say my name. It repeated a thought I had just had. Exactly. No delay. No distortion. I froze again. My breath caught. And for a moment, I wonder if even that was being echoed somewhere before I produced it. The fog thickened slightly around my shoulders, not touching but framing me, like it had decided where I belonged inside it. A faint chime passed through the space again, and for a brief instant, the fog formed a doorway. Not solid, not complete, just an outline in the air where absence took on structure. I stared at it. Something inside me resisted looking too directly, because looking felt like agreement. The voice didn't speak again. Instead, the fog around the doorway shifted subtly, as if waiting for movement that had already been anticipated. I took one step forward without fully deciding to. The ground responded late. My balance adjusted late. Even my thoughts felt a fraction behind my actions. Then I stopped again. The doorway outline remained. Stable now. Waiting. The bell did not ring this time, but its absence felt intentional. And I realized the fog wasn't hiding anything. It was arranging what could be seen, and what could no longer be avoided. Everything stopped the moment I crossed into the space where the bell should have been heard. Not gradually, not with warning. Just a clean break in motion. Like the world had been paused mid-thought. The fog, the streets, even the faint drifting particles in the air. Everything froze in place as if it had been instructed to hold its breath. I stood there for a moment before I realized I was still allowed to move. That was the first wrong detail. I took a step forward. My foot landed without echo, without response. The silence around me wasn't empty. It was structured, like something had been carefully removed from it rather than it simply being absent. I walked. The town was still here, but no longer behaving like a place. It had become a display of paused moments, a half-turned sign, a suspended flicker of distant light, a doorway mid-swing, never finishing its motion, and through all of it, I could hear breathing, not mine, everywhere at once, close enough to feel invasive, but distant enough to remain unlocatable. The bell did not ring. Instead, its absence filled the space like pressure. I moved through the stillness carefully. My footsteps no longer created delayed echoes. They simply disappeared into the surface beneath me, as if the ground had stopped recording sound altogether. A figure stood ahead, frozen mid-step, one hand slightly raised, caught in a motion that would have been walking. Its face was partially visible, but not expressive, just paused in whatever thought it had been carrying. I passed it slowly. It did not react, but I felt something shift as I moved by it, a sense that I was being tracked without movement, observed without change. I looked around. The entire world was like this. Stopped but not dead. Held. I pressed my hand against the wall nearby. It felt cold. Too cold. Not temperature cold. Absence cold. Like warmth had never existed there, and the concept itself had been removed. A faint pressure moved through the space. Not sound. Not vibration. Something closer to intent. The bell was still missing, but I understood now that it wasn't gone. It had become the condition holding everything in place. I took another step, and the pause in reality shifted slightly around me, not breaking, adjusting, as if the world was allowing only one thing to continue moving at a time. Dust hung in the air like suspended thought. I passed through it without disturbance, and it did not respond to my presence at all. Then I saw it, a reflection, in a shop window that should have been dark. Me, but not matching my movement. The reflection stood still while I moved, watching me arrive late to my own position. I stopped immediately. It did not. It kept looking forward, as if it had already accepted a version of me that I hadn't yet become. The breathing around me deepened, still everywhere, still unplaced. I stepped closer to the window. My reflection did not imitate me. Instead, it shifted slightly, just enough to suggest awareness of timing rather than movement, like it knew exactly when I would arrive before I did. The silence tightened. The entire pause world seemed to lean inward, and I realized something that made my chest feel heavier than fear usually allows. This wasn't stillness. It was waiting, and I was no longer paused with everything else. I was moving inside what had decided not to move around me. The clock tower interior swallowed sound the moment I stepped inside. Not in a sudden way. More like sound simply stopped being necessary here. The walls rose far higher than they should have from the outside. I remember looking up and realizing the space didn't respect the shape I had seen from the street. It extended upward in uneven layers, as if multiple versions of the tower had been stacked and never properly aligned. Stone steps spiraled inward, each one slightly worn, though I couldn't tell by what. My hand brushed the railing. It felt warm for a brief moment, then cooled again as I let go, like it had reacted to my presence and then decided to forget me. The bell was above me, but it didn't feel distant anymore. It felt internal, like it had moved inside the structure of my awareness rather than staying above it. I started climbing, slowly. Each step carried a strange sense of recognition, as if I had already taken it before, and was only now remembering the experience slightly late. The walls were marked with faint inscriptions, not carved, not written, more like impressions left behind by repeated attention, lines that shimmered slightly when I looked directly at them, then faded when I tried to focus. My breathing sounded too loud at first, then it stopped sounding like mine at all. The bell did not ring, but I could feel it preparing to. Each pause between steps felt like the tower was deciding whether I was allowed to continue existing at this height. I reached a landing where the space opened slightly, not wide, just enough to feel like a pause in the ascent. And there, I saw something that made me stop completely. Myself, standing farther up, still, facing away, not moving, not reacting, just waiting at a higher point in the tower, as if it had already completed the climb. I couldn't tell if it was me from the future, or something that had been placed there earlier, and was only now becoming relevant. The air tightened around my chest. I took a step forward. The version of me above did not move, but I felt it notice, not with motion, with timing, like it had registered the exact moment I realized it was there. The bell finally rang, not from above, not from behind, from inside my chest. The sound wasn't loud. It was complete. Everything in the tower reacted at once. The inscriptions along the walls brightened faintly, as if responding to recognition rather than sound. I climbed again, slower now. The presence above me remained, still waiting, still aligned with a moment I hadn't reached yet. Each step felt less like movement and more like approaching something that had already decided how this would end. When I reached the next landing, I saw it more clearly. The second version of me wasn't just standing. It was slightly different. Still me, but with a stillness that felt practiced, as if it had already accepted everything that was about to happen. The bell did not ring again. Instead, the silence expanded, and I realized the tower was no longer measuring my ascent. It was measuring how long I would take to recognize myself as part of it. The bell rang the moment I touched the next stair. Not from above, not from below, from inside the motion itself, like the staircase had learned how to speak and chose sound instead of language. I froze mid-step. The sound didn't fade. It stayed in me, not echoing, changing. Each ring felt slightly different, as if the bell was not repeating a single tone, but testing versions of who I was supposed to be. I continued upward slowly. The staircase had begun to shift, not physically collapsing or rebuilding, just rearranging its logic. Steps that were behind me earlier now appeared slightly ahead in my periphery, as if the tower was refusing to agree on where up actually existed. My hand brushed the wall. It felt like touching something that was remembering touch rather than receiving it. The bell rang again, and with it, a voice, not external, not internal either, somewhere in between. You are not the first. The words did not come with direction. They simply arrived, fully formed, like they had always existed and were only now being allowed to be heard. I stopped. The staircase did not. It continued adjusting itself, reshaping subtly beneath my feet, but always keeping me upright without fully committing to stability. I looked up. The version of me I had seen before at the higher landing was gone, but the space it occupied was not empty. It felt occupied in memory, like something had been there long enough that the air refused to forget it. The bell rang again, stronger. The staircase responded immediately. Steps shifted position slightly, forming a tighter spiral. forcing me to move closer to the center of the tower. I felt my balance recalibrating constantly, like the structure was deciding how gravity should behave around me specifically. I climbed. The voice returned. Same tone, same absence of source. You are not the first. This time, something in the dust changed. Fine particles lifted slightly from the steps, forming faint patterns that dissolved before I could understand them. It looked like language trying to exist, but refusing completion. I reached another landing. No room here. Just a widening of space that didn't feel like architecture anymore. It felt like attention. The bell rang again, and I saw movement in the dust. Words formed briefly along the floor. I leaned closer instinctively. They disappeared before I could read them fully, except one fragment. Again, the staircase behind me shifted. I didn't turn, but I felt it, the structure adjusting to ensure I wouldn't return the same way I came. The voice spoke again, closer now, but not nearer in distance, nearer in understanding. You are not the first. My breathing slowed without permission. A thought tried to form, something about remembering, about repeating, but it fractured before completion. The bell rang once more, and this time the staircase stopped changing. Everything aligned, perfectly, too perfectly. I continued upward, and at the top landing, I finally saw what had been waiting. Not a figure, not a shadow, a second arrangement of myself that no longer felt like an individual, just a continuation, standing at the center of the upper chamber, facing the mechanism above, waiting without tension, as if the waiting had already finished long ago and was only being displayed now. The voice did not repeat. It didn't need to. The bell remained silent for a long moment, and in that silence, I understood the staircase had never been leading upward. It had been aligning me with something that had already decided where I belonged within it. Behind the clock face, there was no wall, only space that forgot how to behave like space. I stepped through the narrow maintenance opening, expecting gears, metal, maybe the hollow back of the tower mechanism. Instead, I entered something that felt like a suspended chamber made of layered stillness, where every direction existed at once, but refused to commit to a single orientation. The clock dial loomed behind me like a sealed memory. In front of me, floating gears, not mounted, not supported, just held in place by an unseen agreement between motion and silence. They turned slowly, but not in unison. Each gear moved at a slightly different rhythm, as if time itself had been broken into separate habits and never taught to sync again. The air here felt different, heavier in meaning than in weight. It carried a faint scent of old rain and copper, like something mechanical had been left outside for too long, and then brought inside without cleaning what it remembered. The bell did not sound here. It didn't need to. Its presence was already built into the structure of movement. Every shift of a gear felt like an unspoken echo of it. I stepped forward carefully. The floor wasn't solid. It responded under me, not collapsing, not resisting, just acknowledging contact in a delayed way, like it was deciding after the fact whether I had been allowed to step there. Between the gears, I saw openings, not holes, doors, small, irregular frames floating in place, each one showing something different. A street I recognized from childhood, a room I don't remember living in, a version of the tower, exterior seen from a different height. I stopped at one of them. Inside was a moment I couldn't place immediately. Then I felt it before I understood it. A memory that didn't belong fully to me, but also refused to belong to anyone else. I reached toward it instinctively. The air near the doorway felt warm, like it had been recently occupied by emotion rather than temperature. My fingers stopped just short of the surface. Inside the frame, the scene shifted slightly, not changing, adjusting, as if it noticed me noticing it. The gears around me slowed for a fraction of a second, not stopping, just listening. The bell was still absent, but I felt it building in the negative space between motion. Another doorway flickered open nearby. This one showed something simpler, a child standing still, not moving, not reacting, watching something just outside the frame. I recognized the feeling more than the image, the sensation of being too young to understand what was wrong, but old enough to feel it anyway. My chest tightened slightly. I stepped back. The gears resumed their rhythm immediately, as if my attention had been the only thing holding them in partial pause. A faint vibration passed through the chamber. Not sound, expectation. The doorway in front of me changed. Now it showed a hallway, empty, but familiar in a way I couldn't place without discomfort. The edges of the frame trembled slightly, like it was trying to decide whether to open further or collapse entirely. I heard the bell then, not from above, not from within, from the gears themselves. A low resonance passed through the chamber, and every floating mechanism reacted at once, each one shifting its rhythm slightly, aligning for a brief moment before breaking apart again. The doorway I had almost touched earlier widened, just a fraction. Inside it there was silence, but not absence, a silence that felt inhabited. My breath slowed without intention. I stepped closer again, and the air changed immediately, as if acknowledging that a threshold was about to be crossed whether I chose it or not. The gears around me dimmed slightly in motion, their movement continuing but less certain. The doorway ahead waited, not opening, not closing, just existing at the exact point where something was deciding whether it already happened. The bell returned as everything began to remember at once. Not one memory. All of them. The clock tower didn't shake or break. It expanded in perception, as if every bell it had ever rung was suddenly released into the same moment, and forced to exist together without permission to separate. I staggered slightly, not from impact, from overlap, the air filled with ringing that wasn't layered anymore, but fused, thousands of tones pressed into a single unbearable presence that felt more like understanding than sound. The walls responded. They did not crack. They replayed. Scenes formed across the stone surfaces. Faint, unstable images of people standing beneath different versions of the tower. None of them fully identical. None of them fully complete. Some looked upward. Some were already leaving. Some were simply standing still, as if waiting for something they already knew would happen. I pressed my hand against the nearest wall. It wasn't cold. It was overwhelmed, like it had been forced to hold too many versions of itself at once, and could no longer decide which one to present. The bells continued, not ringing separately, not even echoing, existing simultaneously. My thoughts fractured slightly under the pressure of it. Not pain, accumulation. I saw glimpses, faster than thought could process properly. The staircase I climbed earlier, but from another angle, the alley wall breathing, the forest whispering correctly before I spoke, the suitcase opening wider than it should have, all of it layered, all of it happening, or having already happened. I stumbled backward, without meaning to. The chamber shifted in response, not reacting to my movement, correcting it, as if my position was only one interpretation of where I was supposed to be. The gears beyond the wall, those floating mechanisms, sped up briefly, then slowed, then stopped pretending they were separate from the bell at all. For a moment, everything aligned, perfectly, too perfectly, and in that alignment, I understood something without being told. This wasn't the tower remembering time. It was time remembering itself through the tower. The bell reached its highest point, not volume, totality, and every reflection I had seen before, every version, every delay, every mismatch, collapsed into a single overlapping awareness that felt like standing inside too many moments at once without being allowed to choose one. The wall showed faces now, not strangers, not entirely, familiar in ways that refused naming. They looked like they were remembering me, remembering them. I stepped forward. Or maybe I didn't. The distinction was no longer reliable. The air vibrated like it was holding something back that had already been released. Then, all bells stopped. Every version, every layer, every overlapping echo that had ever existed in the tower's memory. Gone at once. The silence that followed was not empty. It was complete. And in that completeness, something inside the structure settled for the first time without resistance. The walls stopped showing movement. The gears beyond the chamber held perfectly still. Even my own breath felt pause between decisions. I stood there, surrounded by finished time, and realized the tower was no longer repeating anything. It had finished remembering, and now it was waiting to see what remained after everything had been recalled. The silence did not feel like an ending at first. It felt like a settled wait, like the tower had finally placed something down that it had been holding for a very long time, and was now unsure what to do with empty hands. I stood in the upper chamber, without moving, not because I couldn't, because nothing in me suggested movement anymore. Time, whatever form it had taken here, no longer pressed forward or backward. It simply existed around me, layered but calm, like a memory that had finally stopped trying to change itself. The bell did not return, not even as absence. It was gone in a way that felt deliberate. The walls no longer displayed fragments of other moments. The gears I had seen earlier remained still behind the clock face, suspended in a state that no longer needed explanation. For the first time since I entered the tower, there was no sense of being followed by versions of myself. Only the present one remained, or what passed for present. I walked slowly toward the center of the chamber. My footsteps were quiet, but not erased, just accepted without reaction. The floor no longer adjusted or corrected itself. It simply allowed me to exist on it, without negotiation. A faint thought surfaced, small, almost human in its simplicity. I remember my father once telling me that some places don't trap you. They absorb what you bring into them until you stop noticing what you were before you entered. I don't know why I remembered that here, or if I actually did. The air felt layered, but not unstable anymore, more like depth without motion, a still ocean with no current beneath it. I looked toward the space where the bell mechanism should have been. Nothing moved, nothing waited in the way I expected waiting to feel. And then I understood something quietly, without force. The tower was not keeping me anymore. It was incorporating me, not as punishment, not as release, as function. The feeling was not fear. It was recognition without resistance, like a hand finally resting in a shape it had been forming for too long to remember when it started. Outside the tower, the world had already faded from importance, not destroyed, not erased, just distant enough that it no longer pulled at me in any direction. A final soft resonance moved through the structure, not a bell, not a sound, more like confirmation. I did not try to leave. There was no direction that felt like outside anymore, only variations of inside that no longer mattered to distinguish. The silence remained complete, and in that completeness, I understood I was no longer moving to the clock tower. I was part of the reason it no longer needed to ring.